Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the rise of audio storytelling. We're going to talk about it from two different perspectives, both the publisher perspective and also the journalist or the creator perspective as well, and how both the newsrooms and publishers and creators are really helping to drive audio storytelling. I just want to start with a bit of context first of all. Back in 2014, spoken word audio represented about 12% of share of ear from the age group of about 13 to 24. So that kind of young, coveted consumer. In 2022, that share of ear has risen to 26%, so it's more than doubled. And a lot of that growth is driven by podcasts, audiobooks, and other forms of spoken word content, including narrated articles. So beginning with yourself, perhaps Alistair, and the FT's perspective here, talk to us a little bit about how the FT considers podcasts and spoken word audio.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. So, audio is an increasingly important part of our business. It's something that we've really started to focus on in the last sort of 4 years or so. We've actually, like a lot of publishers, we've been doing audio for quite a long time. I think our first podcast we started in 2006. But it was never something that we really took very seriously. In fact, a very senior editor at the FT, who I won't name, referred to it as a hobby for the newsroom. It wasn't part of our business. And in fact, we had half a person. We had someone who's had a dual role, who did audio engineering and production, but also did something else. And over the years, we had this sort of growth of sort of organically created podcasts that were on a fairly random selection of topics. That were kind of like journalists' sort of pet projects. So we had one on foreign exchange, for example, which is a slightly odd topic for a podcast. But it was really in 2018 that we decided to sort of try and take this seriously and really understand where it fit within our business. So we stopped doing a lot of those sort of quite niche shows on banking and finance, which was our core area. And we started doing things on technology, on working life. We launched a daily news briefing, which has become tremendously successful. Because we looked at the numbers really that we had, and we looked at the data that we had, and we realized that there were sort of four things that were really quite interesting. The first was that everybody listens for free, and the FT is obviously a paid for proposition, so there was a little bit of a tension there. The second was that people were listening away from the FT, so nobody comes to the FT and listens to podcasts. They all listen on Apple, Spotify, Pocket Casts, wherever. The third thing was that the data that we did have from Spotify showed that the listeners were all in their sort of 20s and 30s, which is really exciting for a traditional organisation like the FT to get these sort of younger consumers. And the fourth thing was that there was a lot of interest from advertisers, so they wanted to spend a lot of money with FT audio, and we thought that actually we could then pull all that together and say, well, this is a really good way of introducing the FT to younger consumers, building scale, hopefully getting them engaged with our content and demonstrating how valuable the FT can be to them in their daily media consumption, and then slowly start to bring them back to the FT to become readers, paying subscribers, and build their lifetime value as we go forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you were saying that the FT entered this space in 2006, and when you think about podcasting, what really kind of came to being in 2004, the FT was very much an early adopter to the format, but it took over a decade for you guys to really say, hang on a second, there's something here, people want this, and it also took consumers that long. I think everyone kind of notices or recognizes 2014 as the inflection point. Maria, for yourself at HBR, how do you guys think about podcasting? What does success look like, and what have you tried so far? And audio generally.
Yeah, I think audio is a really important area of growth for us in terms of how we think about making content that fits into people's lives, but also how to make our content relevant and relatable to people. So HBR had a long-running, still our flagship show, the HBR IdeaCast. It's a weekly interview show, really important part of the discourse around the most important ideas in business, management, work. In 2018, we launched a show called Women at Work, which was specifically about the experiences of women in the workplace. And we also launched an advice show called Dear HBR. What's been really interesting about a show like Women at Work is it allowed us to target a very different audience. We really wanted to get into women who are invested in leadership and advancing their careers. And it's also just given us different ways to think about engaging the audience. We bring a lot of listener stories into that show. We think about how we can engage the people who are listening and not just be sort of a one-way ticket of telling you what you need to know. We want to hear from you as well. I think if you think about HBR as an ecosystem, the magazine, the website, our audio, video, and we also have a press division, so we make books. If you think about the role of audio and across all of those, our press division experiments with audio. We're experimenting with audio on the editorial side. We have done some experimentation with Alexa, and of course, working with Noah on narrated versions of our articles. We know that there's a future for how people are going to want to consume our content and audio, whether it's original or derivative of other things we're publishing. And right now, we're just trying to rapidly experiment to see which things are the right fit and which things still make sense for us.
Yeah, and I think on that topic of experimentation, it is super important to try different formats, try different distribution models, and so forth. I think podcasting is sort of at the end of that kind of greenfield experimentation. I think we've kind of found a lot of things that work quite well, and we will speak about that a little bit later in the talk as well. To yourself, James, as the only podcast host on stage at the moment, how do you think of it as a creator? Why is it such a compelling way to tell stories?
It's I've got quite an interesting view on all this at the moment because I'm a podcast host of the new Conspiracist, and that's a sort of podcast done with Sony. We and it was the classic, started pretty much in lockdown in 2 bedrooms from people who couldn't leave the house, old school podcast story that you don't hear so much anymore. And it caught on enough to be worth a major investing in it. And is trying the usual sort of mix of subscriptions and ad reads and network ads to monetize. But most of my time spent working at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism as an editor, and we largely work with mainstream media. We will publish in partnership with the FT or The Guardian or the New York Times, and so people don't really see us. And what we're looking to do is to get that little bit of awareness that, hey, here we are, we're this nice little not-for-profit doing good journalism, in the hope that once people know about us, they'll support us. And what we've been doing to look at that is look at audio. It's amazing how much it comes back that that's the way to build not just an audience, in numbers. You can do that on social more cheaply, but that sense of connection. And we've been researching all sorts of bits, and again, because we're a not-for-profit, people probably share more with us and tell us more about what works than they would be. And so, we're looking at doing a regular sort of thing and looking at doing docs, but it's tricky because we've got much smaller resources than either of the other publications. And so anything we do, we have to be able to justify we are spending this money on this instead of on investigating a potential bad guy. And yeah, it does seem to be where the bang for the buck is at the moment. And not, podcasts is the main one, but audio versions of articles are absolutely huge at the moment and seem to be a big sort of driver of demand. And I guess it's an extension of audiobooks, which have really, really caught on. I think every single friend I have who jogs uses audiobooks, and so the audio long read has very much become a thing as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think one of the points that you made is all about kind of using podcast distribution or podcasts as a way to build brand, kind of widen that funnel a bit more. And I remember a couple of years ago speaking with the founder of Tifo Football. If anybody's familiar with their YouTube channel, they were then sold to the Athletic. But he said to me, look, he said, SEO is extremely important for any content business, but he said, unless you're doing video, he said, you're not present on the second largest search platform, which is, of course, YouTube. And I think that line of thinking is starting to enter into the newsroom more and more, and also brands as well that create their own podcast content to say, actually, we need to be here, because otherwise people just will not discover us. Kind of shifting gears a little bit away from the reason why we would want to be in this space. What is it that allows us to create good content? And I think, Alistair, you guys have kind of had certainly 2 huge successes in the news briefing and then Hot Money. Talk to us a little bit more about how that content came to be and what worked.
Yeah, so I mean, the news briefing was, I mean, it's our flagship podcast, it's our daily news update, it's published Monday through Friday. It really almost came about by accident because we were talking to Amazon quite a lot back in the sort of 2017, 2018 about what we could offer on the smart speaker platform, and they said to us, well, you need to provide something that's short, that's snappy, and we hit upon the idea of just doing something that was 9-10 minutes long. But the key thing that our journalists and our editors insisted on was that it had to be very fresh first thing in the morning for the sort of people who read the FT, which tend to be people who work in sort of banking and finance. They get up, they go into the markets very early. So we really wanted to publish at 5 o'clock in the morning in London, which meant we basically had to produce the show, and to this day it's still produced in the east coast of the US, which was a challenge because we didn't have any audio people there, we didn't have a studio or anything like that. But that led us to I think the great success around it, which is that because it's published at 5 o'clock in the morning, when people get up in the morning and they look at their podcast app, we're right at the top of the feed every morning. It's one of the first things they see, and in fact around 75% of the listening takes place before 9 o'clock in the morning. So that is obviously very, very good from an FT perspective because we are really in people's heads right at the beginning of the day, and we're kind of driving what they should talk about and think about for the rest of the day. And also from advertisers' perspective, it's great because it's often actually the advertiser that you hear on the news briefing might be one of the first commercial messages you hear during the day. So it really services both the FT and also our commercial partners very well.
And that's actually quite interesting that you're kind of saying the news briefing sort of sets the agenda for the day among those who listen to it. That really was, I guess, the role of the print paper at some point. You know, it's what's on the front page, that's what we're going to be talking about, and now it's, you know, the FT even thinking about this as being a podcast.
I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, that's one of the things that obviously is, you know, as any digital media organisation will tell you, that habit forming is really, really important. So the fact that we've managed to get these, you know, I mean, they're people that listen basically to a sort of 9-10 minute ad for the FT and for our content and how we can explain all these very complicated stories to people in a really engaging way. They listen to that every morning, and that has a massive impact on the success of the rest of the business.
Yeah, no, I understand. And another podcast, just before kind of moving on to the rest of the panel, that you guys have created is called Hot Money. Maybe speak a bit about that, because I know it's a bit of a controversial topic, let's just say, for a brand like the FT, but how did that come about, and who did you work with to kind of bring that to reality?
So I mean, Hot Money is really interesting because a lot of our audio strategy is around trying to grow the FT brand in the US, because it's a key area, it's a key part of the world that we're focused on as an organisation, and we really wanted to develop a show that was very much more investigative in nature than news worthy. So we partnered with Pushkin Industries, who are a great podcast production company run by Malcolm Gladwell. And we started Hot Money, which is a show all about sin industries. And the first season was an investigation into the porn industry. So it's a very un-FT topic, but we treated it in a classically FT way, which was we did a very deep dive into the industry. The whole premise was just to understand who owns the porn industry and how, you know, in fact, it's the credit card companies that control a lot of what you see, because they have rules around, you know, what sort of content they're allowed their sites to be next to. So it was tremendously successful. I mean, we've had hundreds of thousands of listeners, millions of downloads, and it's really sort of doing what we want to do in audio, which is to learn a lot more about how to do really deep investigative journalism, because I think it's very important for the future of the FT to be able to tell stories in that sort of way. But it also shifts people's perceptions about, you know, we're not just about banking and finance, we are about, you know, industry and you know, companies wherever they might be.
Yeah, that's interesting. And given that particular topic, you mentioned credit card companies, surely they would want to sponsor that kind of content, albeit it's controversial. But like, maybe talk a bit about the kind of monetization side of investigative journalism.
Yeah, so I mean, from our perspective, I mean, something like Hot Money, I mean, obviously it's a very difficult subject matter. I mean, season 1 was extremely difficult subject matter. Season 2, which is coming next year, will also be quite difficult from an advertiser's perspective. So we're really looking at it as a way to sort of grow the brand of the FT and to get our journalists and our message and our brand out there to people who might not necessarily be very familiar with the FT and what a great organisation and publication it is.
Yeah, and maybe moving to yourself, James. When it comes to again, the new Conspiracist, the podcast that you host, like, what kind of drew you to that topic? Like, why conspiracy? Is it a case that you needed to pick a topic that kind of really just excited people, or that was different, or?
It's, I mean, honestly, part of why we hit on it was because we liked it. And I think that's essential, actually. Reluctant podcast hosts tend to have short-lived podcasts. And I think some big brands, have made mistakes in that area. It really works when people are into the projects. Even at sort of places like the BBC, you could tell the Brexit cast, people quite enjoyed doing it. And so we liked conspiracy theories and thought they said something interesting about the world. On a more sort of commercial or sort of tactical level, you sort of need two things. You need something that is a slight point of difference. A lot of podcasts, people end up listening because they like the vibes, they like the in-jokes, they like the team. But it's got to have some basic, it's got to have some frame or some, not quite gimmick, it's a bit more fundamental than that to distinguish it. And we thought it was that. And then you need a frame that can last. And what's good for us with conspiracy theories is we've done everything from pop culture to cancer, and had quite serious cancer people on, to Epstein, to Jimmy Savile, to war in Ukraine. You can, as long as you stay in your lane and acknowledge that they're much bigger issues than you can tackle in a sort of lightish news entertainment format, you can go across such a huge range of stuff. And so you don't quite know what you're going to get from an episode, which I think makes it work. And what, I'm trying to bring that now as a sort of manager to my day job in terms of looking for, if we do a Bureau of Investigative Journalism podcast, what's the thing that makes it interesting for someone to come back to every week?
Of course.
And I think a little bit of that is, personality. I think now people finally respect and understand podcasting isn't radio online. It's got its own vocabulary, its own format, its own beats. But I think actually there is enough of a through thread of, here's what it's like to try and get behind an investigative headline, where's the scoop, and sort of try and do that inside the newsroom. And refining that until it's got that sharp sense of, here's what this is, here's why it's a framing you'll want to come back to, and you'll kind of look for it on your feed on a Thursday, or whatever, maybe a bit more often. I think everyone here's got thoughts on weekly or a bit more regular now. But you want people to be looking for it a bit. No such thing as a fish, for example. If if it's not there at 8 a.m. on a Friday, I find myself refreshing my feed. You want that.
You need that habit formation kind of element to it. And Maureen, going to yourself, HBO, much more professional brand. It reaches people in a different part of their, their career, I would say, or with a different job to be done. So how do you think about kind of audio and storytelling and the creative side of it for a brand like HBO?
Well, I think James said it well earlier. I think we really think about it as deepening the relationship with the audience. So interestingly, and of course there's other business aspects of it, sponsorship, advertising, you're diversifying your revenue streams, that's all fantastic. But we see this as a way to actually deepen that one-on-one relationship and make sure you actually have a connection with either some of the people who make the content at HBR or some of our experts. There's a different way that you connect with them when you hear them or when you're listening to them on a podcast that I think is different than reading or, like you said, just like posting on social media. It's a different kind of relationship. And then interestingly, we did a survey of our IdeaCast listeners in 2020, and we found, again, this was an opt-in survey, so it's not perfect data, that around a quarter of them were HBR subscribers. So if you think about, again, that relationship that people have with our brand, with our content, they're really looking for more ways to experience it, to engage with it. That's where we think there's going to be a lot of future in that, and then also just the future of how audio, video, and all these other mediums start to connect to each other. Part of that is learning, how do we do that well? How do we do that in a way that's uniquely well to what HBR does, which is business and management topics? All of that is something that we feel confident in continuing to invest in that.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. And look, as we come towards the end, it'd be good to hear from each of you kind of what you see as the, well, maybe not the long distance future of podcasting and audio storytelling, but certainly over the next 5 years. Maybe to yourself, James.
I think we need better advertising and tracking metrics. I mean, everyone hates ad tracking, I know, but podcast advertising's still in its infancy. It makes less money than it should. That's screwing creators. It's meaning the content isn't as good as it could be. That's a known problem that's been a known problem for over a decade.
Yeah,
and
slowly
it's
making
hard
progress.
to fix. Yeah.
But to yourself, Alistair?
I mean, I completely agree with you on that, and also I'd add that, like, from our perspective, I mean, we now have this enormous audience. I mean, we have pretty much more listeners than actually pay to read the FT via subscriptions. So they're very, very young, and they're really, really super engaged. And what we really need to understand better is how we can bring them much closer to our subscription products.
Yeah.
And that's a lot about working out how we can track it, but also making sure that we have the right subscription product, because these are people that are very engaged. They're listening for free. To sort of bring them into sort of a $30 or $40 a month subscription is quite a big jump, and the rest.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gareth. Getting those stepping stones between free listening and paid subscribing is really important.
Yeah, and for yourself?
I would say multi-platform. You're going to see more podcasts that are on YouTube, that are in your podcast app, that have other forms, that have newsletters. People are going to be building out, a real network around shows that have something to say and have a voice. And I think for us too at HBR, also just thinking about our international, our global audience as a US-based publication, we're really trying to think about what that global audience wants. I think, we're going to find audio maybe in more and more places in our lives, as we start to get smart audio in our homes. Are we going to start getting suggestions for wherever you are in time and space at that moment of what you might like to listen to?
Yeah.
I think that's all part of the future that we'll all have to navigate.
Yeah, and certainly like a trend that's already kind of well present is, of course, watching podcasts on YouTube. Certainly something that I do during the working day. But we're going to see more and more of that, I think, as YouTube launch their own podcast platform as well. That sort of brings us to the end of this session. So thanks everyone for listening. Hope you found it valuable.
Thank you.